The phone call came at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, and when I heard the voice on the other end, I knew that my life as I had known it was over. The voice belonged to Detective Maria Santos of the Houston Police Department, and she was calling to tell me that my son Daniel had been killed in a car accident on the freeway. But that wasn't the part that made my blood run cold. The part that made my blood run cold was when she said, "There's something you need to see at the scene, Dr. Morrison. Something that doesn't make sense. Something connected to your hospital." I drove to the accident site with my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel, and what I found there would unravel 20 years of lies, destroy my career, and send me on a journey of revenge that I am still traveling today. I'm 54 years old, and I was one of the most respected transplant surgeons in the country, a man who had saved hundreds of lives through skilled hands and steady nerves. I grew up in rural Texas, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher who taught me that hard work and integrity were the only values that mattered in this world. I met my wife Rachel at the University of Texas Medical School, and we had been married for 28 years, raising 2 children in a suburb of Houston that was the kind of place where neighbors brought you casseroles when you were sick and organized block parties on the 4th of July. I had everything a man could want: a successful career, a loving family, the respect of my peers, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I had made a difference in the world. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The truth, as I would discover, was much darker. Daniel was 26 years old when he died, and he had just finished his residency in internal medicine at the same hospital where I had worked for 20 years. He was brilliant, kind, and driven by the same desire to help people that had drawn me to medicine in the first place. He was also, as I would learn too late, asking too many questions. Questions about the organ transplant statistics that didn't add up, about the patients who seemed to recover too quickly, about the wealthy donors whose medical histories didn't match their stated occupations. He had been working on a spreadsheet for the past 6 months, tracking anomalies in the transplant data, and he had discovered something that someone was willing to kill to keep hidden. The night he died, his car had been run off the road by a vehicle that vanished into the darkness, leaving no witnesses and no evidence except for a single piece of metal that the police would later identify as part of a luxury SUV. If you want to know what that piece of metal led to, and why it proved that my son's death was not an accident, you should probably subscribe. The days following Daniel's death were the darkest of my life. I walked through them like a man in a fog, going through the motions of funeral arrangements and hospital protocols while my mind struggled to process the impossible. Rachel was devastated in ways that I couldn't reach, retreating into a silence that lasted for weeks. My daughter Sarah flew in from New York, where she was attending law school, and she held our family together with a strength I hadn't known she possessed. The hospital administration offered their condolences and arranged for a memorial service, and I watched my colleagues deliver speeches about Daniel's potential and my legacy, as if we were participating in a play whose ending had already been written. But I couldn't accept the narrative. I couldn't accept that my son's death was random, that the universe could be so cruel as to take away someone so young and so full of promise for no reason at all. The piece of metal from the accident site haunted me, and I found myself returning to it again and again, trying to understand what it meant. The break came through an unlikely source, a janitor named Earl Williams who had worked at the hospital for 30 years and who had seen everything that happened in the hallways and supply rooms that executives preferred to ignore. Earl had been cleaning the administrative offices on the night before Daniel's death, and he had seen something that troubled him enough to mention it to his wife, who mentioned it to her book club, whose members happened to include a reporter for the Houston Chronicle. The reporter tracked Earl down and convinced him to share what he had seen: a meeting in the CEO's office between Dr. Richard Hayward, the man who ran the transplant program, and a man Earl recognized from television as a prominent local businessman. The man was Victor Castellano, the owner of a network of private clinics and surgical centers that had been making headlines for their innovative approaches to health care. Earl had overheard fragments of the conversation through the door, enough to understand that they were discussing the situation with the Morrison boy and what to do about the data. If you want to understand why the hospital's CEO and a wealthy businessman were talking about my son hours before his death, and what it revealed about the transplant program, I had dedicated my career to. Hit subscribe and I'll tell you everything. The discovery that my son's death was connected to the hospital's leadership sent me into a spiral of investigation that consumed every waking moment. I couldn't confront Richard Hayward directly, couldn't march into his office and demand answers, because I had no proof and no allies. Instead, I began collecting evidence in secret, piecing together the puzzle of my son's death one fragment at a time. I accessed the hospital's databases under false pretenses, reviewing transplant records that I had signed off on for years without questioning. And what I found was devastating. The numbers didn't add up. We were performing transplants at a rate that exceeded what should have been possible given the number of donors, and the survival rates for our patients were suspiciously higher than the national average. It was as if someone had figured out a way to game the system, to manufacture outcomes that shouldn't have been achievable through legitimate means. The implications were horrifying. If the transplant program was compromised, then every surgery I had performed, every life I had saved, was built on a foundation of fraud. The person who finally explained the system to me was a nurse named Patricia Vega, a woman who had worked in the transplant unit for 15 years and who had been carrying the weight of her knowledge in silence. She found me in the surgeon's locker room after a particularly difficult surgery, her face pale and her hands trembling, and she said, "I know you've been asking questions about Daniel. I know what you found in the records, and I need to tell you what I know before something happens to me too." We met at a diner outside the hospital district, a place where neither of us would be recognized, and Patricia spoke for 2 hours without pause. She told me about a sophisticated operation that had been running for more than a decade, a black market network that connected wealthy patients in need of organs with a supply chain that bypassed the legitimate donation system. The organs came from vulnerable populations, undocumented immigrants, homeless people, prisoners, who disappeared without a trace and whose deaths were never investigated. The hospitals, the surgeons, the coordinators, all of them were complicit in a system that traded human lives for million-dollar fees. Patricia had tried to report it once years ago, and she had nearly lost her job and her license. Since then, she had kept her silence, watching as more patients received transplants and more donors vanished into thin air. The connection to Victor Castellano became clearer as Patricia's story unfolded. He was not just a wealthy businessman. He was the architect of the entire operation, the man who had created the network of clinics and surgical centers that served as the distribution point for the harvested organs. His private facilities were where the transplants actually took place, performed by surgeons who were paid in cash and asked no questions. The hospital where I worked was simply a front, a place where the official records were generated and the legitimate cover was maintained. My son Daniel, in the course of his residency, had stumbled onto the connection between the hospital's statistics and Castellano's operation. He had discovered that the innovative approaches being celebrated in medical journals were nothing more than the result of a system that had access to an unlimited supply of fresh organs. If you want to know how deep the conspiracy went and which of my colleagues were involved, you should probably subscribe. Confronting the conspiracy meant gathering evidence, and gathering evidence meant becoming a target. I started sleeping with a pistol under my pillow, a practice that would have seemed paranoid before my son's death but now felt necessary. I installed cameras around my house, changed my routines, and stopped trusting anyone who worked at the hospital. Even Rachel, my wife of 28 years, became suspect in my eyes. She had worked as a hospital administrator before we had children, and she still had connections that could provide access to information I couldn't obtain on my own. But when I asked her about the transplant program, she changed the subject with a skill that suggested she was hiding something. The doubt gnawed at me, making me question everything and everyone, transforming me into the kind of man I had never wanted to be. I was losing my mind, or perhaps I was finally seeing it clearly for the first time. Either way, the investigation continued, driven by a grief that had transformed into something colder and more calculating. The first tangible piece of evidence came from an unexpected source: the luxury SUV that had run my son off the road. Patricia had given me the name of a mechanic who specialized in high-end vehicles, a man who had been paid handsomely over the years to keep quiet about the work he did for Victor Castellano's organization. I found the shop in an industrial district on the east side of Houston, a grimy building surrounded by chain-link fences and abandoned warehouses. The mechanic, a nervous man named Carlos who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, initially denied knowing anything about the SUV. But when I showed him the photograph of my son's car, crushed and mangled on the freeway, something broke behind his eyes. He led me to a storage unit a mile away, and inside, covered by a tarp, was the vehicle that had killed Daniel. It had been wiped clean and repaired, ready to be returned to the fleet, but the damage on the passenger side was still visible if you knew where to look. And there, embedded in the bumper, was a fragment of my son's tail light, the same fragment that Detective Santos had found at the scene. If you want to know what happened next and how I used the vehicle to build a case against the people who killed my son, hit subscribe and I'll tell you everything. The discovery of the vehicle was the turning point in my investigation, the moment when what had seemed like paranoid speculation became undeniable reality. I called Detective Santos and shared what I had found, and she agreed to meet me at the storage unit to document the evidence. But when I arrived at the appointed time, I found not Santos but two men in dark suits who introduced themselves as agents from the Department of Homeland Security. They had been following my investigation, they said, and they had questions about Victor Castellano's organization. They also had a warning. The people I was dealing with had friends in high places, and if I continued to dig without proper authorization, I would end up like my son. I told them I didn't care about their authorization, that I was going to expose the conspiracy regardless of the consequences, and they looked at me with expressions that were almost pitying. One of them, a tall man with a weathered face, said, "Dr. Morrison, you have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't just about some black market organ trade. This is about the highest levels of government, the most powerful families in America. If you pursue this, you won't just lose your career. You'll lose everything." Then they left, and I was alone in the storage unit with the SUV that had killed my son, wondering if I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The agent's warning only strengthened my resolve. If the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government, then it was even more important to expose it. I continued my investigation with renewed vigor, gathering evidence and building connections that I had never suspected existed. Patricia Vega became my most valuable source, sharing documents and testimonies that she had accumulated over the years in preparation for a day when someone would finally have the courage to act. Through her, I learned that Victor Castellano's operation was not an isolated criminal enterprise, but part of a larger network that connected hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, insurance providers, and government agencies in a web of corruption that spanned the entire healthcare system. The organs were just one commodity in a larger marketplace that included experimental drugs, unapproved medical devices, and stolen patient data. Everyone was getting rich, and the only people who suffered were the patients who received substandard care and the donors who vanished without a trace. The connection to my own past emerged slowly, revealed through documents that Patricia had obtained from a former hospital administrator who had retired to Mexico and was willing to talk in exchange for a monthly stipend. The administrator, a woman named Dr. Susan Chen, had been present at the creation of the transplant program 20 years ago, when Richard Hayward first arrived at the hospital with a vision of innovation and a promise of results. She had noticed irregularities from the beginning: the unexplained donors, the unusual recovery times, the wealthy patients who seemed to bypass the waiting list, but she had been silenced with a combination of threats and financial incentives. What she revealed in her testimony was the most damning evidence of all. The program had been designed from its inception as a cover for the organ trafficking operation, and the person who had designed it was not Richard Hayward or Victor Castellano. It was my own father, a man I had believed was dead, a man who had abandoned me and my mother when I was 12 years old, and who had resurfaced in my life only through the tragedy of my son's death. My father's name was Edward Morrison, and according to Dr. Chen's testimony, he had been a brilliant surgeon and administrator who had consulted with hospitals across the country on transplant program development. He had been the architect of the system that Castellano was now operating, the man who had figured out how to create a sustainable black market for human organs. He had disappeared 20 years ago, presumably dead, but the documents suggested that he had simply moved on to other ventures, leaving behind a network that continued to operate without him. The question that haunted me was why he had targeted this hospital, this city, this family. Why had he built his empire in the same city where his son lived and worked? Why had he allowed our paths to cross for 2 decades without revealing himself? And why, in God's name, had his operation killed the grandson he had never acknowledged? If you want to understand what I discovered about my father's connection to the conspiracy and how it changed my understanding of my own life, hit subscribe and I'll tell you everything. The revelation that my father was the architect of the organ trafficking operation changed everything I thought I knew about my career and my family. I had spent my entire adult life believing that I had chosen medicine as a calling, that my success was the result of hard work and dedication, that the values my mother had taught me were reflected in the work I did every day. But if my father had designed the system that I was part of, if his corruption had shaped the environment where I had built my career, then nothing I had done was truly my own. Every surgery I had performed, every life I had saved, had taken place within a framework of deception that I had never suspected. The realization was devastating, and it forced me to question everything, not just my career but my entire identity. Who was I if I was not the man I believed myself to be? What remained of my values and my integrity if everything I had built was corrupted at its foundation? The search for my father became my obsession. I hired investigators, searched public records, and followed every lead that Dr. Chen's testimony had provided. According to the documents, he had been living in Costa Rica for the past decade, using a series of aliases to avoid detection by the authorities who were still searching for him. He had developed a reputation as a medical consultant, advising private clinics and pharmaceutical companies on transplant logistics, all while maintaining his connection to Castellano's operation through a series of intermediaries. He was 76 years old, in poor health, and reportedly worth tens of millions of dollars, all accumulated through a lifetime of exploiting the vulnerable and manipulating the system. I wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation for the choices he had made, to make him understand the damage he had caused to his own son and his own grandson. But I also knew that going after him would be the most dangerous move I could make. He had survived for decades by eliminating threats, and I was the biggest threat he had ever faced. The attempt on my life came 3 weeks after I began the search for my father. I was driving home from the hospital after a night shift, taking the same route I had taken thousands of times, when a black SUV pulled up beside me on the freeway and forced me toward the guardrail. I managed to keep control of my car, but the SUV kept coming, pushing me harder and harder until I had no choice but to swerve. My car went off the road and flipped twice before coming to rest in a ditch. I was trapped in the wreckage, bleeding from a gash on my forehead, watching through the shattered windshield as the SUV slowed, and a man in dark glasses looked down at me. For a moment, I was certain that I was going to die, that my son's killer was going to finish the job and leave me to die alone on the side of the freeway. But then sirens wailed in the distance, and the SUV accelerated and disappeared into the night. A truck driver had seen the accident and called for help, and I was pulled from the wreckage just before the car caught fire. If you want to know who was in that SUV and why they let me live, you should probably subscribe. The attempt on my life galvanized the investigation in ways I could never have anticipated. Detective Santos, who had been skeptical of my conspiracy theories, finally accepted that I was telling the truth. The Department of Homeland Security agents returned, but this time they came with an offer. They would provide protection and resources in exchange for my cooperation in bringing down Castellano's operation. They had been investigating the organization for years, they said, but they had never been able to get close enough to expose the full network. I was their best chance, a man on the inside who knew the players and the procedures. I agreed to work with them, but I had one condition. I would not stop until my father's role in the conspiracy was exposed and he was held accountable for what he had done. They agreed, and the investigation entered a new phase. We were no longer just gathering evidence. We were preparing for war. The information that the agents shared with me painted a picture of an operation far larger than I had imagined. Victor Castellano's network was not just a local black market. It was a global enterprise that connected hospitals, clinics, and criminal organizations on every continent. The organs moved through a complex system of intermediaries, passing through multiple countries and jurisdictions before reaching their final destinations. The profits were staggering, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing through shell companies and offshore accounts, much of it ending up in the hands of government officials and law enforcement officers who had been paid to look the other way. My father had designed the system, but he had been replaced by men who had no limits and no conscience. The task ahead was not just to expose a local conspiracy. It was to bring down an empire that had been built on human suffering for more than 20 years. The operation to expose Castellano's network took 6 months to plan and execute, involving agents from multiple federal agencies and prosecutors from the Department of Justice. I served as a confidential source, wearing a wire and recording conversations with the doctors, administrators, and business executives who had participated in the organ trafficking operation. The evidence we gathered was overwhelming. Financial records showing the flow of money from wealthy patients to the network, medical records documenting the disappearance of vulnerable donors, and testimony from former employees who had been silenced with threats and bribes. Richard Hayward, the hospital CEO who had protected the operation for 20 years, was the first to fall. He was arrested at his office, his hands in handcuffs, his face frozen in an expression of shock and disbelief. Victor Castellano followed a week later, captured at his mansion in the suburbs with a suitcase full of passports and enough cash to fund a small army. But my father remained free, protected by distance and the difficulty of extradition from Costa Rica. The trial that followed was the most sensational criminal proceeding in Houston's history, drawing media attention from around the world and forcing the city to confront the darkness that had been hiding in plain sight. I testified for 6 days, describing what I had discovered about the operation and how it had affected my family. I spoke about Daniel, about the questions he had been asking, and the price he had paid for his curiosity. I spoke about my own complicity, the years I had spent performing surgeries without questioning the source of the organs, and I spoke about my father, the man who had designed the system that had stolen my son's life. The jury deliberated for 8 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard Hayward received a sentence of 40 years in federal prison. Victor Castellano received life without the possibility of parole. And the network that had operated for more than 20 years was finally dismantled, its participants scattered to the winds. But the victory was hollow. My father was still free, still living in Costa Rica under an assumed identity, still protected by the corrupt legal system that his own operation had helped to create. The authorities told me that extradition was unlikely, that the Costa Rican government was resistant to American pressure, that the evidence against my father was circumstantial at best. They suggested that I move on, that I focus on rebuilding my life and my career, that chasing after a dying man was not worth the effort. But I couldn't move on. I couldn't forget that my son had died because of the system my father had created, that the people who had killed him were still walking free, that the man who had ruined my life was enjoying his retirement in a tropical paradise. The rage that I had felt since the night of Daniel's death had not diminished. It had grown stronger, more focused, more determined. The decision to go after my father alone was not made lightly. I knew it was dangerous, that he had resources and connections that I couldn't begin to match. I knew that the federal agents would object, that Rachel would be terrified, that Sarah would try to stop me. But I also knew that no one else would do it. The system had been designed to protect men like my father, to ensure that the architects of corruption could escape the consequences of their actions. If I didn't pursue him, no one would. And Daniel's killer would never face justice. I spent 3 months preparing for the journey, learning Spanish, studying Costa Rican law, and training with a former Special Forces operator who taught me the skills I would need to survive in a hostile environment. And then I disappeared, leaving behind a letter for Rachel and Sarah explaining what I had to do and why. The journey to Costa Rica was the most difficult thing I had ever undertaken, a month-long odyssey through jungles and mountains and the darkest corners of my own psyche. I crossed the border on foot, avoiding the official checkpoints, and made my way to a small town on the Pacific coast where my father was reportedly living. The town was a paradise of beaches and palm trees, the kind of place where wealthy retirees came to escape the pressures of the world. My father had chosen well. He was living in a mansion overlooking the ocean, surrounded by servants and security guards, enjoying the sunset views that he had purchased with the blood of his victims. I watched him from a distance for a week, studying his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities, and planning the confrontation that I knew would change everything. The moment I had been waiting for came on a Tuesday evening, when my father was alone on his terrace watching the sun set over the Pacific. I walked up the beach toward his property, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands steady despite the fear that was coursing through my veins. The security guards saw me coming and reached for their weapons, but my father raised his hand to stop them. He knew who I was. He had been expecting me for months. He told the guards to stand down and invited me to sit across from him at his outdoor table. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other, two men connected by blood and tragedy, separated by decades of deception and loss. Then my father spoke, and his voice was exactly what I remembered from my childhood. Calm, measured, dripping with the charm that had allowed him to manipulate so many people for so long. He said, "James, I wondered when you would come. I suppose we have a lot to talk about." What my father told me that evening was worse than anything I had imagined. He didn't just design the organ trafficking operation. He had been involved in similar schemes his entire career, moving from city to city, building systems of exploitation wherever he went. My mother had been one of his victims, a nurse who had discovered his activities and who had been silenced with a combination of threats and manipulation. The story he had told me about leaving, about being unable to provide for us, had been a lie. He had abandoned us because we had become a liability, because my mother's suspicions were threatening to expose him. And he had watched my career from afar, always keeping track of the son he had discarded, making sure that I remained within the orbit of the system he had created. Daniel's death had not been intended, my father claimed. It had been a tragic accident, the result of an overzealous subordinate who had panicked when my son got too close to the truth. But the accident had been convenient, and my father had done nothing to punish the people responsible. If you want to understand what happened after my father's confession and why I made the decision that would define the rest of my life, you should probably subscribe. The confrontation with my father lasted for 3 days, during which we spoke for hours about the choices he had made and the lives he had destroyed. He showed no remorse. He expressed no regret. He spoke about his actions as if they were business decisions, weighing costs and benefits with the cold calculation of a man who had long ago abandoned any pretense of morality. He told me that the world was divided into predators and prey, that the strong had always exploited the weak, that his role was simply to ensure that the exploitation was done efficiently. It was the most horrifying worldview I had ever encountered, and it explained everything. His abandonment of my mother, his creation of the trafficking operation, his indifference to his grandson's death. He was not a man who had lost his way. He was a man who had always been this way, who had never possessed the capacity for love or empathy that makes us human. And he was my father, connected to me by blood that I could never wash away. The end came on the fourth day, as the sun rose over the Pacific Ocean and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold. I had made my decision during the long hours of the night, weighing the options and accepting the consequences. My father sat across from me on the terrace, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching me with eyes that had seen everything and felt nothing. He knew what was coming. He had always known. I said his name and he looked up, and I saw in his face a flicker of something that might have been fear. I said, "You destroyed my life. You destroyed my son's life. You destroyed everyone who ever trusted you, and you're going to spend the rest of your days knowing that you lost. Not to the police, not to the government, to me, to the son you abandoned, to the family you discarded." He opened his mouth to respond, but I was already walking away, leaving him alone on the terrace as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The story of what happened next belongs to the authorities, not to me. I will say that my father was found dead in his mansion 3 days after I left Costa Rica, the victim of an apparent heart attack that many people found suspicious. I will say that the authorities conducted an investigation and found no evidence of foul play. I will say that I returned to Houston, to Rachel and Sarah, to the wreckage of the life I had built before everything fell apart. And I will say that I am writing this story now, 3 years later, as a warning to anyone who might be tempted to believe that the system will protect them from the consequences of their actions. My father was wrong. The predators do not always win. The prey can fight back, and when they do, the results can be devastating. I am 57 years old now, and I live in a small town in Vermont where no one knows my name, and no one asks questions about my past. I work as a medical consultant, helping rural hospitals improve their transplant programs without the corruption and exploitation that I witnessed in Houston. It is small work, humble work, but it is honest work, and that is more than I could have said about my career for 20 years. Rachel and I are still married, though our relationship has been forever changed by the revelations of the past few years. We are learning to trust each other again, slowly, painfully, one day at a time. Sarah has finished law school and now works as a prosecutor, specializing in healthcare fraud. She says she wants to make sure that what happened to her brother never happens again. I am proud of her, proud of the woman she has become, proud of the way she has turned her grief into action. This story is not meant to be a guide for revenge or a manual for surviving conspiracy. It is meant to be honest about what happened to me, about the choices I made and the choices that were made for me, about the people who helped me survive and the people who tried to destroy me. It is meant to show that even in the darkest circumstances, there is always a way forward. You just have to be patient, you have to be careful, and you have to be willing to sacrifice everything for the truth. Because the truth matters. It matters even when it's painful, even when it forces you to reconsider everything you thought you knew. It matters because without truth, there is no justice. And without justice, there is no peace. If you want to remember that no matter how dark things get, there is always hope, you should probably subscribe.